Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 46th episode of By-The-Bywater, first one of 2023. Great to be back with you. Our holiday break was much well-deserved and enjoyed, aside from all the storms, but we'll get to that. So we're all surviving and we all got nice things, and I hope, and we hope you did too, and that's all good. Oh, and while I'm at it, a particular megaphonic thing, if you are a Patreon subscriber, hint, hint, you can hear Jared and I be part of a group megaphonic podcast that is only available to subscribers. It is called The Greatest Podcast Ever Recorded, and it is a joint mashup of a bunch of podcast hosts across megaphonic to talk about something. Usually at this point, it seems to be the eye will be something cinematic, big, and forgotten, is the best way to put it. And the first one we did was and where the name of the podcast comes from, is called the biblical epic from the mid-'60s, The Greatest Story Ever Told, starring Max von Sydow, a host of cameos, and the Arizona landscape standing in for Israel. And it is at both more ridiculous and more blah than you can imagine from this description. So Jared and I had thoughts about it. So let's just say. So Oriana, you weren't able to be part of that? I can't remember. What was the story there?
I had an obscene amount of work dropped on me the week between Christmas and New Year's. That was like kind of a bummer that I was unable to carve out the 5 hours needed to do all this. Sorry, everyone.
Sure felt like it, let me tell you. So anyway, so if you are a Patreon subscriber, you can get access to that particular podcast as well as all the various bonus bits across many of the other podcasts. We don't really do that ourselves on this podcast because we just put everything in the episode because, hey, that's who we are. So in any event, there will be more greatest podcasts coming up in the series sometime later in the year, irregularly, so keep an eye out for that. We seem to have decided on the next one, but we'll keep it secret for now. We shall see how it goes. Otherwise, we have some news, we have some topics, we have some stuff to talk about. Let's just get right into it. So, Jared, please, with the news. Go for it.
An important note to start the new year with: the HarperCollins strike is still happening, and we intend to honor it as before. So yes, the new Tolkien book, The Fall of Numenor, has been out for a couple of months, but you're not going to hear more about it from us until we have a resolution. Full support, as ever, to the union. News to us surfaced of an interesting creative project out of the UK, where for some decades composer Paul Corfield Godfrey has been working on an operatic cycle of work drawing on the Silmarillion. With the Tolkien estate's full permission, 4 recordings have been released over the previous few years, and the last will be out later this year. We'll have links to more information on this in our show notes, including to an interview Corfield did with theonering.net. Finally, for now, Amazon's announced a wide number of new additions to the cast of the second season of The Rings of Power, most notably Sam Hazeldine, who will be taking over the role of Adar from Joseph Mall. Meantime, directors Charlotte Brandstrom, who directed 2 episodes from the first season, Sana Hamri, and Louise Hooper will be splitting director duties between them. That all said, the showrunners remain the same. So, good luck.
Survive. We wish you all well. And yes, if it seems like why pay attention after we trashed it a couple episodes ago? Look, it's going to be in the news. We can't not talk about it, and we will observe it.
It might get
and it
better.
might improve.
Maybe. I don't know.
I have no hope of that, really, but it might,
Let us be generous in spirit.
Yeah.
It is post-Christmas, isn't it?
They'll tie up the showrunners, put them in a closet, and then do an actual good show and let them out for the premiere.
Showrunners emeritus.
Yeah. At large, showrunners at large.
Oh boy, yeah, there we go. Kick them upstairs, please. So so that it's funny. This is the first that I've heard about this particular opera cycle, and I didn't realize that that's something that the estate was good. I guess because those rights have never really come up that people can do that, because theatrical rights are part of. Well, I should say theatrical, live theater rights were part of the original packaging of the stuff that Zane Expanse's company had a hold of all those years, because they had to give the sign off to anything like the various theatrical productions on, like, Camille of the Hobbit that have happened over time. So I guess operas don't. I don't know.
Well, maybe
the Silmarillion didn't come under that, I'm guessing, because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, I listened to a little bit of it, and it seems like it's not a stage performance. It's just a recording. So it's musical. It's not. There's no performance. Yeah. They didn't even, from the bit I listened to, they didn't even get real musicians for it. It's like keyboard, like synths. It's not. Yeah.
They said sampled, not synthesized orchestra. And I'm like, you do what you can. I mean, but I guess the singers are real. So, hey. but yeah, no, I mean, just the fact that apparently both Rainer Unruh and Christopher Tolkien had like signed off on this, I'm going like, this is interesting to me. So, I don't recall them ever being so involved, let's say, with any other general musical interpretation of Lord of the Rings that's out there. And of course, there are a lot of them out there, thanks especially to power metal bands, often from Italy, or Scandinavia in general. Yeah. But still, though, interesting. It's sort of like, oh, sure, glad you're doing that. Of course, that did also lead to the discovery, as we had a discussion on our Discord. Remember, join the Patreon, you can join that too, about like what the weird Russian unofficial adaptations,
like
that
rock opera thing.
Yeah. That was really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Tolkien is, I don't want to say, folk art, but like, copyright free art, shall we say, doing something out there. So credit to them. And when it comes to the Union and HarperCollins and all that, look, come on, guys. We've said this before, we'll say it again. It's actually been very reassuring to see various authors and agents and other folks basically continuing to support this per the HarperCollins Union Twitter feed and the actions they're taking. So this is good. So we encourage everyone out there. We certainly hope it gets resolved and in favor of the Union sometime in the near future. We would like to talk about Fall of Numenor. There's, we reading through it and all that, but since we can't quite yet, that means we can dig back into other stuff that you can sort of get access to in other ways. So that has led to the focus of this month's topic, the alternate one that I had suggested at the end of the last episode. And so with that in place, I will begin. It's a sign of some weird form of antipathy out there that there are those who would complain that Tolkien only wrote quote-unquote children's tales without realizing that first, they're wrong in the face of it. I'd like to see what parent out there would think Eldarion and Arendis would be their idea of a good night's read before bedtime for their small ones. And second, as time has shown again and again, what can be termed children's literature, whether a My First Read book or the sheer range and depth of young adult fiction, is now an intensely powerful, celebrated, and resonant corpus of material in many languages. The combination of mass market media, starting particularly with printed books, translations from around the world from one language into another, and the sheer delight of such literature at its unquestioned best, the more so because there is obviously no one generic approach to it, means that anyone who thinks we're trying to be either dismissive or showily modest about Tolkien's work when it came to children's literature can, of course, pack sand. What is more accurate is to note that Tolkien himself was a product of his particular time and place, and that he was working in what had become a well-established tradition of children's literature in a British context in particular. While there had been books for young readers of one form or another beforehand, the Victorian era was the first real explosion of interest in this field, and he himself as a young reader, per Humphrey Carpenter's biography, was familiar with many now long-established classics provided by his mother before her own untimely passing. His feelings were not always positive. He enjoyed Lewis Carroll, but not Robert Louis Stevenson or Hans Christian Andersen. But he most especially enjoyed the work of George MacDonald and the series of books of tales presented by folklore researcher Andrew Lang. It's perhaps no surprise that both figures had a role to play in his own creative life in later years. As we've talked about in previous episodes, with Smith of Wootton Major growing out of an unfinished preface about MacDonald's work, and Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, itself often a pointed critique about making such stories too sweetly cloying for readers, originally delivered as an Andrew Lang memorial lecture. Tolkien himself exhibited a clear self-consciousness about his own understanding of what he wanted to create in the vein of imaginative fiction and art of any stripe. His first formally published work was poetry, but the infamous poem Goblin Feet was regarded by him with horror in later years. But arguably the 20 years between the Book of Lost Tales and the start and then shift in tone of working on The Lord of the Rings was in ways Tolkien at his peak creatively writing work that essentially had children as the intended audience. even while he continued to develop and return to his greater Middle-earth legendarium with all its romance and deep tragedy. The Hobbit is, of course, the most well-known of these efforts, in its original form a related outgrowth of that legendarium, while not being an intrinsic part of it, as yet, with a narrator who is much more clearly a character as much as anyone else in the story, with asides, observations, and a sense of pleasing an unseen audience. For Tolkien, this audience was very much to hand. His children, who were eager listeners of many creative tales and stories that he came up with to amuse them, for private pleasure rather than for a perceived market, with The Hobbit being the tipping point where what was wholly private eventually became public. It allowed him to indulge in all sorts of things for his own amusement as much as for his kids. He was very arguably a true master of dad jokes, as well as showcasing a generally wide-ranging interest in all sorts of yarns for his sons and daughter, something which makes you sit up a bit when you remember that due to his father's early death, he himself had little memory of something similar in turn. The Father Christmas Letters is arguably the most personal of these by default, while there are mentions of unrecorded stories such as the dastardly Bill Stickers and his rival Major Road Ahead, as well as the early tales of a character named Tom Bombadil, based on a favorite doll of one of Tolkien's sons, Michael. It was another toy of Michael's, a small lead toy dog, that was lost on a family vacation to a coastal Yorkshire resort in the mid-1920s. That was the origin of the story that eventually became Roverandom, an episodic yarn, accompanied by some illustrations, of a real dog-turned-toy dog's adventures in the world, on the moon, and under the ocean, encountering 3 various kinds of bemusing wizards, talking seagulls, great white dragons, and giant sea serpents, not to mention dogs much like himself, if of a different kind. A sweet, if sometimes surprisingly emotional ramble, but with a well-deserved happy ending. In ways, it's not only one of Tolkien's most immediate real-world stories, thanks to various asides about English society of that time, but also contains more than a few connections to that larger legendarium that was always there for him in seemingly all he did, whether as source or as reference point. In contrast, Mr. Bliss is a somewhat slighter but still amusing tale, allegedly growing out of Tolkien's own frustrations with when he first bought a car in the early 1930s, though possibly already kicking around as a basic story idea some years earlier. Much more heavily illustrated than Roverandom, with its key manuscripts at points incorporating its drawings fully with the text, it's placed in a never-never English country setting where the titular character, owner of tall hats and, but of course, a jeer-rabbit he wants to keep hidden from others, partially so he doesn't have to pay a license for it, sets out one day to buy a car. To say that shenanigans result is an understatement, and if by default one can't help make some comparisons to Kenneth Graham's classic The Wind in the Willows and The Misadventures of Mr. Toad, this packs in a lot over its short length, from 3 bears with an eye for eating and pretending to be ghosts, 2 donkeys doing somersaults into a car, to a family of soup-eating squires who love nothing better than to have their meals al fresco, at least until a whole bunch of people literally crash in on them. Both Roverandom and Mr. Bliss were submitted by Tolkien to Allen and Unwin as follow-ups to The Hobbit, with Rainer Unwin providing a review of the former for his publisher father, as he had for The Hobbit itself. But when that book turned out to be a true hit, and Tolkien was asked to write more stories of hobbits, history took its course from there, with both stories first appearing posthumously. Mr. Bliss in 1983, Roverandom in 1998. Both have been republished since, with the latter most readily found, along with other instances of Tolkien's shorter fiction, in the Alan Lee illustrated anthology Tales from the Perilous Realm. If by default both of these stories have their fame precisely because of Tolkien's sheer stature, they show interesting sides of his literary gift, neither being sweet and sappy stories as such, more with a kind of ridiculous anarchy in the best sense, at once well-mannered and wildly rollicking, where things happen just because they can. And why not? So we'll stop there because it's time to open up the floor. So, were either of you guys familiar with these two? I think not, was the thing?
No.
I had seen, so I have the book, J.R.R. Tolkien, Artist and Illustrator by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, which is a fantastic book if you're interested in this kind of thing, which obviously I am. And it has all of the Roverandom illustrations that he did in it. So that was all I knew about Roverandom, and it had some Mr. Bliss in it as well. But this is my first time reading the two of them.
Yeah, ditto.
And, in some respects, they're quick and easy, and they're intended for that young audience, no question about it. But there's a lot going on in them. I
was actually surprised by how long Roverandom is.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be so much shorter.
I thought it was going to be much shorter, but I was like, there's I didn't
novella.
Start reading it until yesterday. I was like,
hey.
right, got it.
I loved Roverandom.
It's great.
My big bombshell of this episode, though, is that I hated Mr. Bliss.
Oh, okay.
I hated it.
Go for it. What didn't you like about it?
Well, maybe part of it is, if maybe you don't follow me on social media, you missed this news. I did get a concussion over the break. So I was maybe not in the literal right headspace for twee little adventures of stuffed bears and a man with tall hats and all of that. But it was like, the guy isn't really big on structure in general. He doesn't plot the most tight narratives ever. And that's fine. It works when it's just a travelogue. But Mr. Bliss is just one damn thing after another, and none of it, to me, is actually interesting. It's like it's coming from the same head space on his part that gave us Goblin Feet, where it's like kind of twee and cutesy and like stuff just kind of happens, and it's like, no, I named the three bears after my kids' bears, which is, I guess, cute, but also it's like the bears aren't cool. They're just bears. Like, I really, really did not.
I mean, I kind of like how miserable nearly everybody in Mr. Bliss is. I mean, they're all sorts of venal, if you ask me.
I found Mr. Bliss himself a very uncompelling protagonist.
Well, he has no characteristics aside from having hats.
Like, I did like the bear. I could actually see this being a very fun bedtime series of bedtime stories, I guess, where it's like, okay, now we're going to have this little trifle about, Mr. Bliss running into the lady with the cabbages. Yeah. And
there's no innuendo in that statement, by the way. That's literally true.
I could not help but for people who have watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, I could not help but think of the my cabbages guy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, you put your finger on something that definitely irritated me about Mr. Bliss, and not about Roverandom, which is that the protagonist is just kind of a name with no real traits. Like, he wants a car, and then the car vanishes from the narrative for huge chunks, or it felt like huge chunks to me. Again, reading it with brain damage, I don't recommend that in general. But especially not when you have to talk about something later.
TBI doesn't make for really great reading.
Yeah. But he doesn't, like, people talk about Frodo as an example of a blank protagonist, but Frodo absolutely isn't. He makes decisions all the time that drive the story forward. He has his own viewpoint. He's doing things that matter. And Mr. Bliss kind of just causes chaos without actually having any feelings about it. Exactly. He doesn't choose any of this. He doesn't even seem to have reactions to the accidents, aside from the pictures where he's like, oh my God, I hit somebody. And that's like, okay. Yeah. But he's not doing anything. He doesn't move anything forward. It felt like, again, traumatic brain injury.
Setting that aside, dare I say the I don't know if we call it great, but I mean, this is a story without a moral.
It's a trifle. It's just a trifle.
It is a trifle, but because it is just one thing after another,
it's cotton candy.
There has to be some kind of through line, whether it's the protagonist being like Alice in Wonderland, just kind of hating whatever's going on. Like, that's fine. That's totally valid. He doesn't even do that. He's just like, oh, I guess I'm going to go to somebody's house for lunch. And then it stops being about him for pages and pages and pages. So, like, why is he the viewpoint character? And anyway.
It's one of those things, I clearly maybe have a little more fondness for you guys, but
I was charmed.
That's fine. I know that this is like
a relative sort. I mean, this is something we were never going to, frankly, dedicate a full episode to for fairly obvious reasons. So squeezing it in here as far as our grounds for discussion there. And I mean, the thing that sort of struck me again reading about is that basically it's sort of like, I the sheer pettiness was sort of like, I like you. No, I like you. No, wait, I don't like you. No, I'm going to eat your cabbage. Now I'll eat your food. And the Jirabbit is sort of like, hi, I'm random.
Yeah.
It's very adorkable.
Yeah, very.
the Jirabbit.
You could see that being a character, Marcel the shell with shoes on, like, a little friend here, and I've got a Jirabbit, sort of towering over them, or something like that. So, it was a good movie though, that. And then of course the line about the Jirabbit, well, Jared, how did you put it when you noticed it yesterday?
Oh, right. There's a line about, like, he basically eats his way through Mr. Bliss's house at one point. It is unconscionable how little the Jirabbit actually appears, because the Jirabbit's great.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a line about him. he's munching some carpet. And I was like, oh my god, language
Incredible.
has marched on since 1920 whatever.
Between that and teleporno, I'm telling you,
It is amazing.
Teleporno is unforgivable because he definitely was aware of Greek vocabulary. Munching carpet is like, okay, probably he didn't know that one.
Yeah, I do wonder when that idiom sort of took on the meaning that it currently has today.
Let's Google it just right now.
Let's not. At least not right this second. So, but I mean, stepping back a bit, maybe less sort of. I mean, what do you think? In terms of, we've talked a bit about the art. Some of the illustrations were random, of some which are truly fantastic. But Mr. Bliss, of course, is much more just sketch. But still, I think it's some like some of the interests of like the forest at night and things like this, and how he uses the giraffe.
Beautiful illustration.
I found them very charming. Like my dad has not a ton of skill as an artist, but like he would draw funny little figures, and it reminded me very much of that. And I think that context is like, oh my god, like you can see that, like you can see spots where Tolkien has trouble with certain figures and is just doing his best, and it's the only word I can think of for it is just charming. And that does a lot for me.
Yeah, no, I like the one illustration when they're all like sitting around having tea at a pub and all that, and the illustration says, "And this is where the car and actually all that is, but I don't want to draw it. I'm too tired."
Yeah,
that's classic medieval marginalia right there. It's like, it's over there. So.
Yeah, and it was funny. I mean, looking at it and going, there's a lot of things in here that are like, of course he's the one who's doing this, like facsimiles of receipts and things.
Yes,
and the plot arc being sort of like The Hobbit, where this protagonist like ends up on an adventure and then comes back home to chaos in his home and has to like pay a bunch of bills and stuff. It's like,
and there's a boffin there.
There's there's literally a Gaffer Gamgee in here.
Yeah, there is. Yeah,
always.
Yeah, I enjoyed a lot of it in a sense, but I don't. Overall, it's just like.
I understand your literary critiques.
Yeah, no, don't blame me on that. So anyway, so Mr. Bliss, there it is. It's a trifle. He amused himself, and it's quick. And if you find it and enjoy it, there you go. So, but this way we can say we've accurately talked about it. So,
well, I would have. I mean, I know you're trying to segue, but like really quickly, I would have enjoyed it more, I think, if it had been like the Father Christmas letters, where it's like, here is one of the events presented on its own,
right,
and you get that as its own thing rather than like turning a page and it's like just kind of one thing after another, but getting it in doses the way Father Christmas letters is structured, which is like, it is almost that way already, but he just didn't tell it that way.
Right,
like that would have made it. It would have improved it so much more for me, rather than being this really, really shaggy series of events.
Yes, and indeed, like I indicated, the wind in the willows, it is not. So
no, it's not.
No. But something that has a wonderfully powerful, I don't want to say resonance, it's a different sort of thing, is Roverandom, and it is we're talking about in much more detail. It is a remarkable story, as I indicated. Jared, you sounded very taken by it. So your initial thoughts?
Oh, I loved Roverandom. I like Oriana. I didn't read it until yesterday, but that was because my library didn't give me the book until yesterday, so I'm bitter about that. But anyway, it's so gorgeous. Like there are like when the whole sequence on the moon is like top tier children's literature, where like everything on the moon is sort of reversed from the way it is on Earth, but that's not the narration never points that out. You're just left to like luxuriate in it. Like the sheep are the size of bugs, and the spiders are obviously, because it's Tolkien, the size of like houses. And then on the dark side of the moon, everything like the sky is now white, whereas on the white side of the moon it's black, and there's these like gardens where children come when they dream, and the moon is colorless except for like little glimmers of like sparks of things in the woods that I don't think they're ever quite, I think they're insects maybe, but they're not really explored. They're just there. It's so many grace notes to this setting, and it's so beautiful. Yeah. The rest of it is fine, but like the moon part is what really, really makes this for me. And it is a significant chunk of the book. Like it's not like it's one scene and everything else is whatever, but like, Roverandom is really good.
And Oriana, your initial thoughts?
It reminded me a lot of the Velveteen Rabbit, and I was somewhat derelict in my research on this. But do we know when exactly this was kind of worked on?
Oh, well, this came out in there. Yeah, I'd have to double check on the publication date for Velveteen Rabbit. This was originally inspired, as I mentioned, by a trip that was in the mid-20s, and the final form of this, at least as typed up, and that is probably a big difference between that and Mr. Bliss. Mr. Bliss just seems to be Mr. Bliss, and there's a story, whereas this was something he worked on for one way or another over a decade, casually, just as something that he had sort of teased out the idea and worked on it, and then submitted it in 36, I believe. So
so Velveteen Rabbit was like 1922 was when it was published as a book. There may or may not have been influence.
No, there was definitely something in the air, though, around that time. Like, there's a lot of children's literature
anthropomorphizing toys feels very much like it was in the water. And I think it's just kind of natural because children do that. Like, when I was a kid, me and my younger siblings, we each had our own room, which was amazing. But each child's room was a kingdom of its own. And all of the stuffed animals, were within that kingdom, and they all had, they had like a national identity almost. And
let's scrap the rest of the episode and talk about this.
Right. There would be wars between the kingdoms. Like my brother's room, he was really into elephants and whatnot. So his had like a more jungle-y sort of theme. And so there would be conflicts, which is kind of weird that like we couldn't think of, something other than and there was peacetime adventures as well. And so I think it's just natural for children to anthropomorphize their toys. And that's a very fertile storytelling angle, and everyone seems to have the same sort of Toy Story idea of the toys can't move when you're looking at them, but they can when you aren't. Like every children's story involving toys that move has that rule, and I think that's fascinating that everyone kind of reproduces that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how else are they going to do it? Like, you can't see them moving. Like, they've got to move that way. Yeah. I never thought of toys like that when I was little. They were like,
oh, really?
Yeah, they definitely had their own identities. Like, I never named any of them because I was like, well, it may not be their name.
Oh, wow.
Like, I don't know that. I don't know their name. They can't tell me their name, so I'm not going to give them a name because it could be incorrect, and I don't want to call them by the wrong name.
Wow.
But I never thought of them moving. It was more like, I don't know, totemic is the right word, but like they were entities that didn't speak or move or whatever, but they were definitely personified. They were like they just sort of sat around, and that was fine. But
they definitely had their own internal life.
They had their own personalities that I was vaguely aware of, but I didn't want to commit to anything on them because I didn't want to assume.
Wow.
Sure. That's very, very, very thoughtful of young Jared.
I'm trying to think of my own examples when I was a kid with things like this, because I had a few specific, toys and things that I sort of could have anthropomorphized, but I don't know. Maybe that just means I'm a freak. I can't say. But it probably just sort of channeled in different things and sort of like, something that comes to mind with Tolkien's own approach is they talking about how, and this is from Carpenter's biography and other comments elsewhere about how when he was young, he and his brother Hilary would, dream up their own little stories. And I think there were mentions too of various, those things where they would have similar sort of things. And also, of course, that's where Tolkien first played around with his idea of creating a language. And we all know where that led. So what's interesting, I think, is that he took that sort of gift for taking something and spinning something out of it. I mean, the circumstances, the creation of Roverandom are interesting to me because it's basically it's kind of the same way that Tolkien is much in something like Lord of the Rings, where he creates Galadriel or he creates Gonburigan or creates these characters like, oh wait, what have I done? Who is this and what's their story?
Yeah, and they appear.
Right. Yeah.
But I also see I have both been the child that has lost the toy and also been around children who have lost the toy, and consoling the child who has lost the toy is a difficult thing to do, and it's just really wonderful to imagine Tolkien, poor child, has lost this toy and is inconsolable, and you are coming up with a way, and through telling probably like just, you know, a little story about like, oh, it's all right, he, you know, nipped at a wizard's trousers, and now he has to go to the moon, and then all of a sudden it turns into this whole thing, and it is pretty joyful to think about that process. Like, you know, I'm sure, I don't know about the details, but that seems like a very plausible way of this happening.
Yeah.
I think that is part of the joy of it too, is that Rover is for all that we have him as a very, you know, just this little bit of him as a protagonist, just a short little story, is such an engaging protagonist. He's he's very relatable. I like the fact that you could theoretically take the story, look at one way, you know, a rude little dog learns manners and is rewarded at the end, but that's not really what happens. It's more sort of like he realizes there's something. He's more apologetic as he goes by and he tries to work things, but the story doesn't beat you over the head like it's so like, you know, the equivalent of the good fairy doesn't come. It's like, see, you've learned to be nice now. You don't get that. Instead, it's more a matter of, oh, I maybe shouldn't have done that. You should do better. And then you're dealing with personalities that, especially what's wonderful is that if you're a kid and dealing with these very, very distinct personalities, all of whom are very different and very weird and all that, it's like he gets along with the moon dog and the mer dog very nicely. I love the bits and details talking about how the immediate mode is trash talking and Tolkien's basically saying, of course, they'd be great friends like 5 minutes later, and things like that. A wonderful detail. But how all the wizards are all such weird characters is the best way to put them. I mean, the sense of their own agendas that everyone kind of loves and hates everyone else, and they're always getting in arguments or more. It's a very, very kid's eye view of, oh, is this how adults deal with each other?
They're all so petty and ridiculous, and I just love how bad Pam with Artaxerxes.
Yeah.
I love how bad he is at his job, and how Tolkien doesn't try and...
he has like bad performance reviews, like that's an actual plot point.
He gets complaints all the time. He's no good, like, you know, and they're like, well, you know, not a bad guy, but you gotta go. And
we need a more competent wizard.
We're not sugarcoating this at all. Sometimes adults are just bad at their jobs. I love that. I love that.
It's wonderfully it's earnest, and you know, and the viewpoint shifts too. Is like we're always seeing it, of course, through Rover's eyes, and we get things like, you know, a very, dare I say, Toy Story moment of when he's like, you know, put up in the toy stuff, and sort of like, you know, it's inevitably these days, of course, after the past, you know, couple of decades, that's how one frames the story in your head, thanks to that sequence of movies. But still, getting that kind of viewpoint of it from that particular time is just really interesting, and just, you know, the wonderfully absurd conversations like. There's a part where he's talking with a shrimp.
Yeah.
Yes.
and I love how there isn't some sort of bonding moment. It's sort of like, yeah. Well, you're going to do this. Well, you're
try being boiled.
Yeah. Like, we'll turn red with anger.
Yeah, like he doesn't. I feel like at one point he's like, well, you're going to get eaten anyway, so I don't have to be nice to you. Like it's that kind of that vibe. Like he doesn't have to be their friend because they're already dead. Their fate is set. Like
it's lovely. It's sort of the humor really goes all over the place. What is interesting, and this is kind of, you know, this is a way maybe to, you know, start to incorporate this into broader discussions of Tolkien as a children's book writer, you could argue, is how the narrator here does have similarities to the narrator of The Hobbit in a way. It's sort of stepping outside with the sort of editorial comments and things like that. It's clearly a mode that he enjoyed and knew how to do. It's something that you get a sense of what Tolkien was like actually telling these stories when he puts those moments in there. And as a side, I absolutely love, you could say, the more when I say adult moments, it's a classic aside to, like, you know, the older readers or listeners, whoever might be out there, you know, the equivalent of, you know, the modern day pop culture reference to something from like the 80s that the adults in the audience will laugh at and the kids are like, huh? Because they were just born like 5 years ago. But like one of my favorite ones is about halfway through because like one great bit about for everybody, one great bit about one of the wizards is the Man in the Moon. Perhaps Tolkien's most recurring character across all his creative endeavors. The more I think about it, and this one gets the mail from Earth via a seagull, which is a delightful touch, and gets deliveries. And there's a bit where Roverandom is on the moon, and he's got his little friend, the other Rover. Oh yeah, all the other dogs they encountered named Rover. which is a wonderful running joke.
I love that.
It's just sort of like, well, you're the first, and that's why he's Roverandom. And it's talking about sometimes the dogs even dare to go spider baiting, biting webs and setting free the moonbeams, and flying off just in time while Spidos threw lassos at them from the hilltops. What a wonderful image. But all the while, Roverandom was looking out for Postman Mew and news of the world. And this is where I'll say to listeners, if you do not know that one of the chief English tabloid papers for many, many years, starting back in the 1800s and only wrapped up fairly recently, was called literally News of the World. So that's the joke here. So Roverandom was looking out for Postman Mew and news of the world, parenthesis, mostly murders and football matches, as even a little dog knows, but there is sometimes something better in an odd corner. What a comment. What a random and he has comments like that throughout about they're these little very Tolkien-y jabs about the stupid modern world I'm in, like like the ginger beer bottles on the tops of Mount Snowdon and other things like that, and as Oriana was pointing out, the Artaxerxes and his particular failures as a civic servant down for the in the Mer Kingdom in the ocean and everything that happens there. I love how elaborate that got.
The man in the moon immediately just throws most of his mail away.
Yeah,
and that's really fun to me. It's like, oh my god, this is like almost 100 years ago, and it's the same thing. Time is a flat circle.
I'm pretty sure the scene is he's ripping open the envelopes, just tossing stuff, and the seagull is trying to pack everything back.
Yeah,
which is so funny.
Just trying to catch him up, going, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so delightful, and I can't even pronounce his name because it's such an awesome name. But I'm going to try to do this. Samathos Mathadides.
But he insists on pronouncing the P in front of it, and it's like this wonderful running joke
because he knows him well enough that he can be like, he doesn't deserve that P.
Yeah.
And I just love this conception of a wizard, which is basically Tolkien riffing on the idea of basically seeing a pile of sand on the beach with a couple of sticks pointing out of it and imagining, oh, those are his ears. And I'm like,
he's asleep under there.
I'm like, what a beautiful idea. No wonder he was so creative.
I love that he's like he could unenchant Rover, but he's like, I don't know if I really want to pick a fight right now with Artaxerxes. We're not mad at each other. I'm not gonna.
Right, things are going good.
We're not gonna do that. Yeah, you can go have an adventure on the moon until he cools down, and then we can see what we can do about that. I think that's so. I don't know why that's so amusing to me, but I think another children's book would have him be like, "Yes, I'm the kind and generous magician who will undo your enchantment," and then that's okay, cool. But this is no, it might not be polite. It's very it is engaging fully with adult dynamics in a way that children can understand. Oh, I don't want to start beef again. Kids do understand that. You're it's like being at somebody else's house and the rules are a little bit different, and you don't.
You're like, wait, you keep your shoes on in the house? Okay, I guess.
Yeah, that sense of arbitrariness is great. It's not arbitrariness in the storytelling necessarily, even though it is an episodic story. I mean, essentially, if anything, and this is just leapt to me just now as we were talking about the cycle of the things. It's almost Baron Munchausen is what it is. You start on the Earth, you end up on the moon, you come back and things like that. It's almost that in miniature. It's sort of like Ramble, but it's not really per se an arbitrary story compared to the real sense. As Oriana was saying, these adult dynamics, the arbitrariness of adult dynamics, you can't do that. And that is a wonderful thing to translate. And it says something about Tolkien's own experience, maybe as a parent, but maybe even as a kid. I'm sure, when he was growing up, he encountered that more than once, especially given, of course, the tragic circumstances of his parents dying early and sort of being shunted from one thing to another and
having to deal with different authority figures in vastly different spaces.
Right.
Adjust to that and learn to be polite to them, I guess.
Yeah.
Rover.
Yeah, and some like the Man in the Moon are gregarious, although clearly sort of just sort of off on their own plane, and they occasionally deal with you, and other times they're just sending you to go out and play in the yard. I mean, it's essentially
they'll feed you, but you gotta learn to manage your own self, basically.
Right, yeah. And if you need to get somewhere, when they do visit the dark side of the moon, you just sort of you got to go in. I don't want to. Just kicks them in and meets them down later. It's
he throws them into a shaft that leads through the center of the moon, and it's okay. away.
and like we arrives there's this huge evil spider out there. Of course, it's like, yeah, get away, and all that sort of thing. And I do love the bits of adventure. I mean, the whole sequence with the great white dragon is a wonderful bit of rollicking adventure in the middle of it all, and a really good one too. I don't know, since if you were reading the tales of if you were reading the Alan Lee illustrated version, let me show you the. Although I'm sure Jared, you've seen it, the illustration, the ink illustration of Oriana hasn't seen it. I'm holding it up for her right now. I hope they. Yeah. But that is the.
Oh, delightful! That's very similar to the Smaug illustration.
Yeah, there's a lot of trial runs for the Hobbit going on here.
Absolutely, yeah.
That illustration, I love that illustration so much. It's very the mountains are very detailed and very flat, and the dragon is a classic sinuous Tolkien dragon. What's very funny to me is that the Hammond and Skull book, where they're talking about the Roverandom illustrations, they're like, this one's not as successful. And I was like, what are you looking at? This thing is great. It's not supposed to. They're dinging it for not being three-dimensional enough or something like that. And it's no, it looks great.
I've met them both many years ago. They're nice people, but yeah, we'll differ on that point. I mean, no, go on, Jared, please.
Well, I don't know if I really had a thought after that, but his illustrations for Roverandom are overall really good, and I was disappointed by the Alan Lee one, which is weird because I love Alan Lee, but he's not the right illustrator for this.
Yeah,
because he's a little too realistic.
Yeah. That's not what you want for this, or it's certainly not what I would want.
Yeah, it's sort of in the real world. They go to real places. They mention real places too, Artaxerxes is from Persia, that kind of thing. But it still is a very different reality from ours, and you don't want the illustrations to be that kind of realistic. And I think this is one case where he's the ideal illustrator for his own stories, which isn't always true.
Right.
In my opinion.
No, very much agreed. And we get more of the moon than the end of the ocean, but the other ocean parts are really nice. The cover,
I love those.
Yeah,
I'm an ocean person, so that sort of thing is just catnip to me.
Yeah,
I love the thousands of sisters, and so it's sort of
the king of the sea can spare one of his daughters as an exile because he's I've got others.
Yeah, I've got all these things here. Yeah,
I love her life. I love that she's just her husband is a bit of a jamoke.
This isn't another running Tolkien thing of marrying a woman who's so much cooler than you are.
And she's just everyone loves her, and they move to the land, and she's just so cool that no one points out hey, you've got a tail. You're a mermaid.
She's hyper competent. She's so much cooler than he is, and it's wow, she must really love him if she's
right
with all of it.
It has to be true. So, what is the I love the here's some of the pleasures of language from that whole sequence. So this is where Artaxerxes, having screwed everything up, has been told to go away. And he basically sort of he basically goes and decides to destroy all his magic and all that. He's just sort of And this is a case where Tolkien just going with the lists and all that, but it works because he has such great joy of the language and vocabulary. So he went into the workshops and collected all his paraphernalia, insignia, symbols, memoranda, books of recipes, arcana, apparatus, and bags and bottles of miscellaneous spells. He burned all that would burn in his waterproof forge. I love the idea of a waterproof forge under the water.
That is just stuff under the sea.
Yeah, exactly.
And the rest he tipped into the back garden. Extraordinary things there took place there afterwards. All the flowers went mad, and the vegetables were monstrous, and the fishes that ate them were turned into sea worms, sea cats, sea cows, sea lions, sea tigers, sea devils, porpoises, dugongs, cephalopods, manatees, and calamities, or merely poisoned. And phantasms, visions, bewilderments, illusions, and hallucinations sprouted so thick that nobody had to play any peace in the palace at all, and they were obliged to move.
Not someone deliberately putting a he's not deliberately putting a curse on the, but again, he's so bad of a wizard that
he's this is somebody else's problem now. I'm going to throw all this garbage out. I clearly don't need it anymore because I'm a good wizard. He's just a little bit vindictive, but
castle is too haunted for anyone to live there anymore.
I love the way that magic sort of works occasionally in this book, where it's it's almost always a physical object. Like the man in the moon is always uncorking spells.
Yeah,
or like there's this where Artaxerxes is just burning a bunch of stuff that is like magical on its own, and there's very little aside from Artaxerxes telling Rover to become a toy, which obviously is what happens. It's just like every spell is something that you like physically engage with. I don't know. I find that really interesting. I wish I'd read this before we had our episode about magic, because I think that's
this tactile sense of things. Yeah. It's obviously not systematic. It's just simply Tolkien just playing our own lives, but it's a great image, and it has that sense of, this is, again, there's certainly no way she could have known, and it's not that there are other writers in this, but in the same way that Ursula K. Le Guin's Ursi wizards are essentially, skilled workers with their tools. This is kind of the sense here. Some of these wizards are clearly better at it than others.
Yeah.
And yes, the whole, as Oriana saying, the performance review aspect and dealing with being a public official. Here's another one of my favorite bits when the ocean people start complaining. Let's see now. These are so great. The complaints had come in by post. Complaints with a capital C, of course.
Yep.
Of course, as you can imagine, all kinds of things go wrong in the sea that not even the best Pam in the ocean could prevent, and some of which he's not even supposed to have anything to do with. And then he describes all sorts of like disasters and things that happen. The Merfolk have always put up with all this, but not without complaining. They liked complaining. They used, of course, to write letters to the Weekly Weed, the Mermail, and Ocean Notions. Ocean Notions
made me laugh so hard.
Yeah, it's so silly, but it's so perfect.
It really is. And to continue, they had a Pam now, and they wrote to him as well and blamed him for everything, even if they got their tails nipped by their own pet lobsters. They said his magic was inadequate, as it sometimes was, and that his salary ought to be reduced, which was true but rude, and that he was too big for his boots, which was also near the mark. They should have had slippers. He was too lazy to wear boots very often, and they said lots besides to worry Artaxerxes every morning, and especially on Mondays.
Dude, like that idea of like Monday is always the like it's so relevant still today. Like poor Artaxerxes getting like probably the Sunday scaries because of all the complaints that are about to flood on Monday. It's just very relatable. The physical aspect of the magic is really interesting to me. Being focused on objects, especially when you compare to like the elves themselves in later writings, which are not magical in and of themselves, but I guess sort of more in tune with the natural world and therefore better able to manipulate it. It is interesting to think about, like, it's not an opposing view, but I think it might be kind of a evolution, I guess, in how one thinks about magic, or just like, here is how I think about magic in this world, in a world that is much more like our own versus one that is not.
Well, I think we talked about this in the episode about magic, which, go listen to it if you haven't listened to it, which is, it seemed like his ideas about what magic is in all of his work evolved over the course of his life, where in the initial, very early writings, it's kind of like fairy tale magic, like, oh, you say a spell and it happens, and then it becomes magic is an art. Like you make something that is magical. You are not casting a spell exactly, although that still happens. And then from there it turns into the elves having power over the natural world because they're so in tune with it, and they're just like, what they're able to do is just like achieve their visions the way they want to, which looks magical to humans because nothing is ever as good as it is in our imaginations, that kind of thing. So, and this I think is fairly early on that continuum where it's like people are still saying spells and stuff, and it's still kind of fairy tale-ish, but it's moving into the art phase of it. Which is really interesting.
There's this is something as well, slightly shifting gear in terms of, you could say magic, but also the ties to the wider legendary and the wider work and all that. Because again, the Mr. Bliss is, maybe not uniquely like this, but it really does, it almost is thoroughly divorced from it, and yet you still have Gamgees and buffers, so it's sort of like, there's still ties in. Whereas Roverandom very explicitly is touching on the imaginative world as it is. I mean, it's supposed to be our modern day, the modern day world, England 1920s, given the references and all that, and yet it's a flat Earth. But there is the whole sequence where Ewan, the whale, takes a Roverandom to go see essentially Valinor from the sea.
Had to work that in there.
That made me sad in a bizarre way, because all I could think when I read it was like, if I had read this when I was a kid, that moment would have been so incredible for me. Like, if I had no other context for Tolkien, maybe if I had read The Hobbit, but that was it, which would have been at that time all I had read when Roverandom, came out, it would have activated so many little neurons. Like, it would have been so powerful. And it's really cool now, but it's more like, oh yeah, there's Valinor, like making a cameo, I recognize it, and it's fun. But I think as a kid with no other experience of Tolkien reading that would have been like the moment where I really fell in love with the book. And I didn't have that moment as an adult because I already fell in love with Tolkien.
There's no mystery,
Right.
So having that lack of mystery in that moment, I recognized what I was missing by not reading this in 1998.
Yeah.
But it is a lovely touch. I mean, you do get it's nice because the names aren't given, at least directly, Elvenhome, etc., and all that. It's pretty clear as to what it is. Right.
There's something about it that just is like the word Elvenhome. It just it does activate something very deep and like say more right now.
Yeah.
I need to. What do you? Well, hold on. Let's go back. Let's tell me more. And there is no more.
Well, I had that moment around that age reading The Hobbit when he talks about how the Wood Elves did not go to Fairy in the West the way the High Elves and the Deep Elves and the Sea Elves did, and I was like, oh my God, what's going on there? That is so cool. I need to know more. Right? Say more about that.
Yeah.
And that would have been a moment like that in Roverandom, but I didn't get that. Anyway, so nostalgia for a thing that never happened.
There's a German word for that, isn't there? So,
yes,
surely.
The character of Ewan is great because Ewan appears briefly, if I remember right, in the Book of Lost Tales, and is certainly sketched out with Tolkien's original map of Middle Earth.
Familiar?
Yeah, the original map of Middle Earth actually includes Ewan swimming around under the deep waves and things like that, as like the one living thing shown on that map. So it's sort of like, hey, so it's you see that, but that also ties in. Speaking of Book of Lost Tales, the sort of after effect and the idea that the Cottage of Lost play, where the kids come in their dreams, which forms the basis of the story, is very much, again, that is the other big element carried over here, with the dream world on the dark side of the moon, and where Rover meets brother number 2, as Michael is termed in this one,
his former owner,
and I think that's a really lovely moment. I mean, for when Tolkien nails sentiment in a way that is not gooey sticky, but instead just sort of like, a sense of loss. He's really good at sentimentality threaded through with loss. And I think that's the sense here too, is that, there's the joy of sort of like, oh, there you are, I found you again. And then again, arbitrariness, boom, all of a sudden, brother number 2's gone. He woke up.
Yeah. I might have liked the book more actually if that had been their last encounter, where they promised to meet up again, and then it never happens. And like, spoilers for this book, I mean, they do meet up again, and they're very happy together. Rover has grown up more, like he's a more mature character. The boy, it's fine with that, I guess. I don't know. But it's like having that moment of connection on the dark side of the moon in this place that is very like dangerous to get to. It's very, very beautiful as it is. And then having them meet up in real life is like, it's fine, but this is my storytelling preferences, I guess. It would have been a little more bittersweet, which is a flavor that I love in literature. So, but it's good. Like, I loved Roverandom. This is not a criticism. It's just like, I might have been
a personal preference.
A little personal preference.
Yeah.
I take it you're one for the happy ending there, Oriana. So.
Yeah, I bet as a kid, probably around 11 or 12, Jared, I bet I would also be like, I think actually that. But now I'm
Is
just
that how I sound to you?
No, that's me. That's my snotty tween voice.
Yeah.
Just want to make that clear. My snotty tween voice, and how I would have said that. Yeah, but now I'm just like, I don't want subtlety. I don't want downer endings. I'm all about that isn't actually true, but I do enjoy a happy ending now, much more than I used to.
I think part of, for me, why it it feels like it should have ended the way that I would have preferred it is that because it is Tolkien, and even in The Hobbit, which is children's literature, there is an ending that is, it's happy, he's back home, but he has lost a lot of what makes his home for him. And even though it's like he can afford silk waistcoats and nice tobacco, and he's fine, he's not unhappy or anything. There is something has irrevocably changed. Right. There is an element that is missing from this happy ending. And it's the same in Lord of the Rings, where it is a happy ending, but it is also incredibly sad. And I was, because it's Tolkien, I was kind of unconsciously expecting that kind of ending, where the boy and the dog never meet up again. As a children's author, he's totally capable of doing that, and he didn't. And that's definitely a conscious choice on his part, because it's an ending that he did a lot. But yeah, that's part of why I was like, it's gonna happen this way. This is gonna be so beautiful. This illusory encounter in a garden on the moon is the last they see of each other. That's so perfect. Yes, and then it doesn't happen. So.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with both of you. This is what it comes down to. It could have gone either way. The optimist in me, which is always there, the Mr. Bounce, is very much happy with the happy ending. But I also like how the ending is. I like how it's not just a happy ending. You get the whole thing where he's talking to this grandma, and the grandma's like, "So what is it now? What is it? What happened?" You know?
Yeah. Which feels like a conversation that actually happened.
Yeah. Actually, it is sort of like, you did what? How did this go? Totally would make sense to me, for sure.
Your imagination, how cute.
There. So
it is when you're trying to follow along with a young child telling you a story, and you're like, wait.
Go back again. Or you just nod and smile.
Right?
You just have to.
What was that about the moon?
Yeah, and we went where? So, but yeah, no, and again, also the other illustrations, the color illustration that's on the cover of Roverandom here of the Mer Kingdom. That's another one to really stand out. It is just gorgeous, and both that and the ink one of the White Dragon, all that. I like how both of them, the background mountains or sea peaks in this one just sort of fade away into the distance. He does that in both of them. It's kind of an underrated thing. It really adds the sense of depth about both, and his eye for color is just really, really good. It just that's a lot of detail. I also like how it's on a lined piece of paper, one of his old exam booklets or something somewhere, and he just sort of just does this elaborate thing. It's like,
what's on the other side of that?
It is kind of great. I do like the one fish that's sort of like swimming almost face on, going like her, and
like
then
her.
And then up in the corner, you and the whale's like, down. It's like, okay.
It's just hanging out.
It's wonderful stuff. It's I mean, and thinking about, maybe to wrap up, I mean, thinking about Tolkien as a children's writer is interesting, because I sort of hinted at this at the start of the introduction. Too often, I mean, this has been the case ever since Edwin Wilson's slam on Tolkien back in the mid 50s. But the idea is sort of like, all you're doing is writing stuff for kids and things like that. So, and it's sort of like, well, that's a dumb judgment. One, but
kids don't deserve great literature.
Yeah. And it's just sort of like, I mean, that's been sort of a thing that sort of hangs over the head of Tolkien and a lot of other things since. And sometimes you can sort of overreact to that. This is just as good as X, and sort of like, well, sometimes your examples you pull out maybe aren't as good as something else. But for me, it just sort of shows that there's this real resistance that I think really has changed with time. I think now over the past few decades that it's sort of like, only kids read that. It's more sort of like, hey, people can read it on
kids of all age.
Yeah, it's just sort of like the idea that good literature still works on very deep levels in many different ways, even if it's supposed to be theoretically written for a kid's audience. And I think that's something that that is a potent, quote unquote, legitimate form of like critical response. Only kids will like it. It's sort of like out the window. And I think we can more look at something like these shorter works and the other ones that we've talked about over the past is sort of like, this is him when he was a young father, when he had young kids. this is kind of naturally what he wrote and did on often stuff. You know, he didn't really come back to this in later years. The closest he would have done would have been when he put together the Tom Bombadil poetry collection, and even that was more just sort of like a combination of accumulation and other things like that. So it's just interesting to reflect on, really. You know, there's one could say more, I suppose, but maybe that's kind of where I will. Maybe I will just sort of wrap up on that. These are interesting works. Mr. Bliss, if you find it, enjoy it and treat it with a 20 minutes at most. You'll need to sort of go through it all. Roverandom, though, yeah, if you can find that, stick with that. That one I think has some that surprised even me looking at it again. And I think I'll end there. Okay, well, we are looking ahead to our next episode. It is Oriana's choice of topic. Oriana, what are we going to talk about next time?
Well, and as usual, I have chosen a character study.
Hey.
And we're going to talk about Gollum.
Oh, it had to happen. It had to happen.
That was on my list of suggestions that I was going to get to at some point. No, not like for next, like, this would be cool. So I'm glad that we're on the same wavelength here.
Yeah, talking about the Two Towers, the Peter Jackson film, really, I was like, we gotta really dig into this guy, because there's a lot there. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
My precious. Yes, everyone get your best imitation on, depending on which variant or version you like to imitate the more. So, because there are a number right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, the most compelling character, perhaps, of them all. But we will have our thoughts. That'll be good. So, okay, so that'll be our next episode. Well, wrapping up here. Again, the old intro is currently on hold. Or old outro, I should say. We'll figure that out. But as usual, you know where to find us, Megaphonic FM/By-The-Bywater, and of course, just subscribe through favorite podcast services, etc. And you can find us on social media scattered hither and yon, but we've got links around and things like that. Or I'm on Mastodon all too much now, in a good way. Let's see, Jared, you're still predominantly on Twitter, and Oriana, you're mostly Mastodon at this point, or not? Or?
No, I've like kind of I don't check Mastodon much anymore. I've really been enjoying just being in various Discords. So I do recommend, if you have a few bucks a month to do the Megaphonic Patreon, it's a really fun Discord. It's
agreed.
A pretty chill
it's a great community.
Yeah, it's not only our host, we just have a number of listeners there. It's a good way to chat. We certainly welcome more folks in. And hey, if you've been listening to us for almost 4 years now and you haven't had a chance to talk with us, come on board. It's good fun.
We're so funny on Discord. We're amazing.
We're truly grandiose. So, and it is a chance to see us react in real time as random bits or memes or things come up, of which there are many, and more things besides. So do look for us where you do. So in any event, that is going to be it for now. We will see you next month. Looking forward to it. As always, you can always contact us. Gosh, why have I forgotten our email? It's bythebywater@gmail.com. Yes, that's it. So you can always do that too. So until then, we will talk to you next time. See ya.